Buonasera, buonasera a tutti, benvenuti.
Good evening to you all, and welcome. I would like to now call upon the two gong players, Beatrice and Alberto. I learnt their names beforehand. They're especially young. How old are you? My name is Beatrice, I'm 12. Alberto, and I too am 12. I must say, great name, as you probably know, and as the audience knows, but as Professor De Rico didn't know, but we've just informed him, you have a gong and you can use it at any particular moment in the course of the conference, so therefore interrupting the speaker to ask a question. The question has to do, obviously, with what is being said. Let's try and see.
Direi che è perfetto. A quel punto io vi passerò il microfono.
I would say that's perfect. So at that point, I will give you the mic and you can ask the question. So, as I mentioned before, we have Professor De Rico. Professor De Rico is the Director of Research at the Centre National pour la Recherche Scientifique, which is the equivalent of the Italian CNR, but it's in France. And he's also a researcher at the Bergen University in Norway, but he's Italian. But more, he was born in Foggia in southern Italy, but very young. He was but a baby, and he moved to Turin here, where he studied at the university. And so we're especially pleased to have brought him back to Turin, because he lives in France, but I think he lives all around the world, so we're especially pleased to have him here with us. Piero, probably you have already met him. Yes, I was lucky enough to meet him a few years ago when Tutto Scienza had only been published for a few years. Tutto Scienza, the Stampa Daily Science section, started in 81-82, so towards the end of 81, Professor De Rico, who was a bit younger at the time, as I was too, wrote a few articles. He says very few, but I remember quite a few. And then, as often happens to very good researchers, he got onto a train and he went to Bordeaux, and before Bordeaux somewhere else in France, and he liked it, so he stayed there and has been there. Obviously, luckily, research is an international thing and knows no borders, so from the point of view of a researcher, being in Bordeaux or Turin or the US or Australia is exactly the same. For us, it is a pleasure to have him here in Turin. And he is going to be talking about something which this morning was also debated with 1,200 students from high schools, because we had a special GIovedìScienza Science on a Thursday for schools. We organized 2 or 3 every year for primary schools, of junior high schools and high schools. This year and now, today, it was a theater piece on science. And they were talking about evolution. It was snakes and ladders, but no snakes and no ladders, and no one acting the fool there, yes. And they told the story of human beings from the very early findings of bones, which can be attributed to a species which is close to ours, up to Homo sapiens, and therefore to the cultural developments of Homo sapiens. We're going to go back to this evening. Professor De Rico will be talking about a very short period, about 80,000 years, take or leave a few years. Yes, while this morning we started from the first cell. So, but this evening we will be talking about these 80,000 years, I believe, discovering very interesting things, because I don't know if I have to say it beforehand. Maybe it's not right, but at this point you have to say it. On science, you know that science is published on a Friday. It's the equivalent of Nature, which comes out on a Thursday in Europe, but the tomorrow's science will have the results of his publication. So in theory, we are still embargoed. I don't know, so I can't say it. If I had understood it or heard it, maybe I wouldn't have understood it. So it's up to Professor De Rico to tell us what's coming out on Science tomorrow. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for being here. It's the opportunity to see even school friends, high school friends that I hadn't seen for 42 years. So thank you very much to Science on a Thursday, GIovedìScienza, for having invited me here to talk, Donatella Actis and Pino Zappalà, and all those who made it possible for me to come here to Turin for a day. I will be talking about a very vast subject, symbols in the mind. If we think of the oldest symbols, for example, the imagination of some of you, we'll go back to the early figures, such as the Chauvet ones, which were discovered a few years ago in France, 36,000 years ago. Less well known, this Indonesian site that was published in Nature a few years ago, where there are some calcite prints, handprints, about 39,000 years ago, and this sort of local wild boar is about 35,000 years old. Or Africa, the oldest representations of figures, which are on plaquettes, found in Apollo 11 Namibia website, site that is about 30,000 years old. Now, figurines are not all and everything. In fact, I would say they're just the tip of the iceberg. Symbolic thought is something which refers to the ability of all human societies to transform the world which surrounds us, to process it. All human cultures are able to give meanings to the world that surrounds us, and therefore give a name to the trees, to the clouds, to the moon, and not only to give a meaning, but also to create a taxonomy of meanings, but also bind them amongst themselves, creating what I would call a symbolic symbol, and to transfer them with some mutations as if they were genetic mutations from one generation to the other. If we now observe traditional societies, you see that the first use for symbols is the body itself. There are scars, there are paintings, tattoos, mutilations. By doing so, we transform our body into a symbol and thus transfer the meanings to the members of our group or to the group that surrounds us. Definitely, without this ability to attribute a meaning to symbols, there would be no religions, there would be no rituals, there would be no maths, there would be no computers. That is to say, all the elements that are the hallmarks of societies as we know them would not exist. 30 years of research on for example, cognitive skills of chimpanzees show us that they're able to attribute meanings to symbols that have no iconic relationship with the symbol itself. The chimps are able, in some memory experiments, they exceed, for example, human beings. For instance, if on a screen you give a chimp for a fraction of a second a number of numbers from 1 to 12, they're able to reproduce the sequence which human beings are not able to do. But chimps have never been able to generate a symbolic material culture, and this use of symbols is something which developed in a lab in contact with human beings. So how did this ability develop? And how long have we been able to produce symbols for and incorporate them into matter? If you'd invited me 20 years ago, the answer would have been very, very different from the one I'm giving you today. 20 years ago, we thought that this ability had developed very rapidly around about 42,000 years ago, when the first human beings, we thought, arrived from Africa and developed it. And this is called the human revolution. That is to say, the revolution of human cognition. And this would have been proved by the presence in archaeology of musical instruments, statues, paintings, possible systems of note-taking, ornaments, and the like. This vision existed, but then in the year 2000 it was replaced by the out of Africa, that is to say, the development of modern developments. In fact, modern developments and the symbolic thought amongst it developed gradually in Africa in association with the origin of our species at least 200,000 years ago, and according to recent research, probably 260 or maybe 300,000 years ago. This theory suggested that there was a gradual development with innovations, and that innovations, therefore, should only be found in Africa and not amongst the archaic human populations that between 300,000 years and about 100,000 years in various parts. These two visions were based on a reading of the biology which has changed. That is to say, in the past, 20 years ago, we thought that Neanderthals and modern humans were two completely different species, and that there was no possibility of cultural and genetic exchanges between them, while now we know that this vision, this archaeological and genetic vision, is currently questioned. That is to say, we know that every new generation of data that we have from genetics show that Neanderthals exchanged genes with modern human beings, the human beings with Denisovians, and also there were some Melanesians. And unless there are people with African descent here, all the people in this room have at least 2 or 3% of their genome which can be traced back to Neanderthals. So instead of a genealogical tree, we have a network of genetic connections and probably cultural connections between Neanderthals, modern human beings, and Denisovians. So I'm an archaeologist, and the first part of this talk I will be focusing on the reasons why archaeologists and anthropologists or paleoanthropologists no longer accept the idea that there was a human revolution, a moment where suddenly we became all modern and we have symbolic behavior. In the second part of my presentation, I will try and explain why the vision, the African vision, or the out of Africa, that is to say, of a gradual origin linked to human beings, is something which can be questioned. The single origin. In fact, what are the innovations? And I will be talking about innovations here, which we've come across archaeologically in Africa, and which show that it is no longer possible to accept this vision of an immediate, sudden development 40,000 years ago in Europe. Some of these are not symbolic, but are technological. For example, an article that was published in Science on a well-known South African site which I worked on for 15 years, which is called Blombos, which is about 150, 200 kilometers east of Cape Town. Some colleagues showed that a technique which is very advanced, working stone, which that is to heat the stone, and then by pressure, which we thought was a European 20,000-year-old invention. It was something that Africans also had more than 70,000 years ago in South Africa. We also have evidence that shows that the tips with handles was developed 500,000 years ago in Africa, and probably from over 60,000 years ago. Some Africans in the area which is now South Africa, the Oisenpoort culture, started developing fragments which were attacked with some ochre and substances which would help them stick together. Sort of putty-like. I've worked on these bone instruments that are very similar to the ones that we found in Europe 40,000 years ago, which are, for example, in Katanga for 95,000 years ago, Sibudu, where we have some sort of instruments or tools, I should say, that were a bit like Neolithical axes, over 70,000 years old, some tips which are at least 70,000 years ago. Now, up to about 2005, we thought that the oldest ornaments were the ones in Europe, the oldest ornaments. Well, now we know that there are ornaments that were also in Africa, the oldest ones being 120,000 years old and found in Morocco. This is a vision of the sites where the early ornaments were found, and they're always seashells. The seashells are of the same species in the same site, so they're relatively simple ones. But we have very specific information showing that behind them there were some behavior patterns that were rather complex. In South Africa, in Blombos, there is a Nasarius kraussiana species, which we know from our studies were shells that were gathered alive, harvested alive, and then perforated, while in North Africa, the same genus, but the Gymbosulus species, and we know that they were gathered dead on the beach, but sometimes the natural holes were enlarged so that they could be used as ornaments. The interesting thing is that in some sites in North Africa, they're sometimes 50, 70 kilometers from the coast, which means that there is a known natural process whereby these shells could be found at that distance. It might also suggest that these shells were exchanged, were used as an exchange between people who lived on the coast and people who lived inland. Interestingly, in South Africa, as in North Africa, these shells, these early ornaments, were also covered in ochre. Now, in some cases, when they're preserved, the beads were covered with pigment, and this suggests that it was deliberately positioned on the object and not the result of, for example, being in touch with skin, which was ochre treated, or with thongs. Now, we also found that in some areas covered in very small lots, 50 by 50 centimeters, we found white and black shells, and carrying out research on the various techniques used and comparing it to natural processes that can change the color of the shells, we proved that it is possible that these Blombos populations, not only did they heat rocks to be able to work the stones, but also had found some techniques to make some of the shells darker so that they could alternate light and dark shells. In another one, we studied the measurements of these shells and shown that measures change according to the archaeological layer, and therefore we tried to reproduce experimentally the wear on these shells. And since we couldn't wear them for 20 years, or we don't know how long for, we attached them to a machine which shook them for hours, and so we reproduced the wear which we found archaeologically, and we see that there was a change in fashion, the earliest one we know, between the upper and lower layer of this site. And also in Africa, we have the oldest burial associated with a child's grave, a child where this 6-month-old baby was placed along with a conus breus, which had been perforated and which also again had ochre remains. One of the big innovations which has become better known in Africa is the one of use of pigments. Now, pigments are sometimes found in very ancient African sites, but it would be necessary now to go back to them and reanalyze it to see that this rock had been brought by human beings. In fact, we don't know how ancient this behavior is in Africa and how much it was natural, but we can say that from about 300,000 years ago, the presence of red pigments in Africa is something quite common. There is a debate on the use of these pigments. For some, these early pigments and the use is the proof that pigments were used symbolically, while others point out that, for instance, as you saw before, the red dust added to resins, for example, to hold the handles, was used. So there was some functional uses, utilitarian uses, we could use the pigments for. So there is a debate amongst researchers for those who say pigments clearly are the indication of a symbolic use, while others consider that this is something that has to be proved. Up to a few years ago, all the things that we had of the use of pigments were the fragments, we could say as if they were little chalks of use, and they were the discoveries made at this site called Blombos in South Africa, which helped us understand what type of recipes or tools were used. And this is something which I worked on too. Very interesting because we have about 100,000 years, and the colleague Chris Henselwood, who was working there, discovered a container, that is to say, a large seashell. At the bottom, it had some ochre residues and all the tools that were used to treat this. So there was a double association. We studied in detail each one of the tools to try and gain a better understanding of how the ochre had been adapted. Using the microscope for the sand, we realized that in this mix there were fragments also of spongy bone or of semi-burnt bone, coal, and that the two techniques had been used to modify or process the ochre. Ochre is very hard, so in some cases it was cut splint as if it were a flintstone, and then it was crushed and ground. Here you can see a lamella of ochre in the mix, and these are the fragments of all these small splinters or shards. It was a bit like scraping off, as if it were a grater, these pieces of ochre to then reduce them to powder. We also know why this was happening. We also know that there was a liquid use, because here you can see there's a line which is a bit like what you might find on a coffee cup. If you don't drink it immediately, it leaves a rim, and here you can see that there is a rim too. We don't know what the liquid was, but this sort of mix had been stirred, because in some cases here you can see some scraps which we think that is probably due to the finger of the person, and which intercepted some ochre and marked the nacre of the seashell, the mother of pearl, in other words. Here you can see the elements containing it, and we can see that there were at least two different types of ochre, probably from two different areas. This the study that we published, but in this site there are others, just to tell you, this hasn't been published yet, which we will study in the next 2 or 3 years, and this will give us a more accurate definition of the various techniques to produce ochre. This is a unique one-off. There are no comparable ones that we found. Then, except for that we have the cave of Porcupine in Ethiopia. This is a PhD student of mine, Daniela Rosso, and I put the slide not only because her parents are here this evening, but because she studied incredibly. She studied 4,400 pieces of ochre and the tools, the processing tools. This is a more recent site, 40,000 years, and she applied confocal microscopy to characterize the roughness of the facets that were used to abrade or scrape off the ochre. She has been able to prove that these fragments of ochre had been scraped on different mills, and that every time there had been the piece of ochre had been kept, and these facets are very small. So the amount of ochre that was produced every time was very, very small. And this indicates the fact that it was used symbolically rather than functionally, because if you need ochre, for example, to use it on hides, you need large amounts. Another thing which we worked on in these past few years was to try and understand with traditional societies what interest they had in using ochre. And I worked with the population, and Daniela Rosso did too, in Ethiopia with the Dihammer, and I worked in particular with the Ofahimba in the north of Namibia. There's a documentary that you can see if you write the color of the Ofahimba on the web. I worked with these women and I understood how they worked ochre, and it's also interesting to know that this type of dichotomy between symbolic function and utilitarian function doesn't exist with these populations, because the two go together. In fact, we showed that ochre, these women say we use ochre also to protect our skin from the sun, from insects, and we showed that this iron oxide powder protects the skin from the sun, so it has a symbolic and utilitarian function hand in hand in the traditional use. Another novelty which we saw in Africa and have observed since 2001 is that in African sites you have abstract representation. In Blombos, for instance, there are 18 fragments of ochre from 100,000 years to 70,000 years where there are these incisions. And in other 3 sites dated between 59,000 and 34,000 years ago, I can show you these objects a bit better. There are some abstract decor or patterns, in particular on ostrich eggs. Ostrich eggs have been used even more recently. In fact, the sands of the Kalahari still use them. They pierce them, they then drink the egg, and subsequently use it using also a stopper, but they use them carrying them in nets or buried them in sands to then have water, and this might be necessary because the environment is very dry, and they might find them weeks later or retrieve them weeks later. This is something that was being used for the past 64,000 years. In a recent study, and here we have Giacomo Giacobini, who is here, but who also participated. We took also into consideration a system of annotation or count. It comes from Africa, from this border cave in KwaZulu Natal, and you see that Here we have this fibula from a baboon, and there are these incisions from different tools. So rather than a decoration, is that over time they've added information. And the prehistorians have been able to interpret this and give it a numerical value. All these innovations found in Africa might suggest that there was a gradual arrival of innovation which was linked to the origin of our species. And in fact, the out of Africa model was the one that we had to consider as the most precise and accurate one. In fact, there are reasons why we are led to believe that this idea that out of Africa and symbolic behavior only is part of the story, and now I will show you why. Well, first of all, for instance, abstract representations can also be found outside Africa in periods that are previous or contemporary. For example, we published 3 years ago the results on this shell. It's a freshwater shell. It's a zigzag. We redated it to 540,000 years ago. And then in some of the behavior patterns disappeared in Africa. That is to say, there is no evolution, a continuous evolution of changes, but some were lost. For example, ornaments, African ornaments, the ones I was talking about, between 320 and 70,000 years ago, disappeared about 70,000 years ago. And when they reappeared, they are ostrich egg ones, a bit like the ones that we had in Kalahari, and which they still produce to date for tourists. And it is only towards 45,000 years ago that we start to see in Asia and Europe, in Eurasia, a diversification of ornaments. In fact, found in Siberia and in particular in Europe, tens and tens of ornaments. Now this, apart from an area of India and China, which I'm currently working on, where the oldest ornaments are beads made out of ostrich eggs that goes on up to 10,000 years ago. And in China, they used to make beads 32,000 years ago. In an article which now dates about 10 years, we tried to understand what meaning this enormous diversity of ornaments is concerned. In the first culture of the Upper Paleolithic, which is called Laurenician, there are over 160 types of ornaments found in 116 sites. And we tried to see if these ornaments were present randomly in the area, or if there was a logic underlying their presence. This graph may appear very complicated. These are the various types of ornaments, and these are the archaeological sites where they were found. The program organizes the presence and absence. Every time there is an ornament, every time there's a little black square, so that you can piece together these sites that have similar ornaments. And you can see that in this period, that is to say, the Aurignacian one, 38,000 years ago, roughly, there are some groups that have that share their ornaments with others, but there are others too. For example, this macro set C that doesn't share their ornaments, and each one of these colors indicates a region. So this graph tells us that every region has its own ornaments, and that they share some of them with the region close by. But as you go further and further, you find people who is wearing different ornaments. We interpreted this as the cultural geography of Europe in this period, and we in fact developed the idea that this might be an index of the ethno-linguistic geography of these early human beings, European human beings. One of the reasons why we can't believe that everything comes from Africa Africa is that a lot of the behavior that I illustrated in previous slides are found with the Neanderthals in Europe. Neanderthals used very sophisticated skills to work flintstones. We know that they too used some gums and resins, and in particular the resin which comes from the birch tree. And the oldest site is the Campitello one, 180,000 years, and the Neanderthals too used gums and for adhesives. And Neanderthals used also pigment, red pigments. The oldest ones are found at Terra Mata, 400,000 years. There are others at Belvedere in Maastricht in Holland, and more recently in France they used black pigments, the fragments of magnesium oxide. We also know that, for example, in Fumane they found fossils sometimes 90 kilometers from the site, and they covered them with pigment. La Cueva Anton in Spain, this shell was modified. The Neanderthals added pigment on this side, which was white, while they didn't change the other one that was naturally red. Now, last year, a member of my lab, Jacques Jobert, published on Nature an incredible discovery. That is to say, he proved by dating the calcite present in a particular site called Bruniquel in the Pyrenees that the Neanderthals 170,000 years ago had gone down 200 meters within this cave. They had broken 4 tons of fragments of stalagmite, and they'd used them to create a circle. Currently, we have no explanation, no utilitarian functional idea of a site of why they might have created this circle. So this might have been also the result of a symbolic action. Neanderthals, so we also know from a certain number of sites, they gathered the last top phalanxes of some of the predator birds and also used their feathers, mostly the black ones, also to use them symbolically. In fact, the Neanderthals also produced a series of incisions and some abstract motives, possibly not as complex of some of the Blombos ones, but some, and this is an article that we've just published of this bone from Lepredel, that apparently there were numbers that existed behind these productions. Now, I'm not going to enter the detail, but the Neanderthals were also known because they had burials. There are many more Neanderthal burials in Europe and in the Near East than known ones of modern beings in Africa. In the last Neanderthals, and this is a topic which has been the cause of debate for at least 20 years, associated to a culture known Le Châtel Péroniano, that is to say the Péronian châtel in the north of Spain and France, more than, as well as creating very sophisticated tool stones, also created ornaments which are very similar to the ones that I created a few slides ago. They used a lot of pigments, red and black, and also very sophisticated bone tools. And most recent study that haven't yet been published and that will be published in a monograph very soon show that these last Neanderthals had an industry on ivory, in particular mammoth ivory, that was very sophisticated and which was used to produce some tips. Now, this is the Rennes cave, the Grotte du Rennes, and there are both human Neanderthal remains with the ornaments and many ornaments as well as tools, as I was saying. This was interpreted very differently by researchers involved in this So this has three levels. There is an Aurignacian and a Gravettian, as well as the Châtel-Péronian one. Here you can see the top ones are attributed to humans, modern humans. But they say if there are also ornaments in the Châtel-Péronian one, it's because they percolated down, while other researchers, including myself and some colleagues, have worked on the distribution of these objects and have tried to show that there was no percolation, and it was the Neanderthal people that produces this object. For example, in something that we're now publishing, we were involved in the study of ornaments, and you can see these ornaments here. Oh, I see there's a question.
Scusi, vorrei sapere se secondo lei senza questi ornamenti saremmo arrivati a questo punto.
I would like to know whether in the absence of ornaments we would have been able to understand this. Would we have reached this conclusion? What is this point, in your opinion? Do you think that ornaments were essential in the development of human beings? Not only ornaments, but ornaments, I would say, are the indicator of a complex society, because when we see how they are used in traditional societies, you can see that ornaments are not something as we see in present-day society. That is to say, we don't consider it so important, while they're very important in traditional society. If you look at a person, if you look at their ornaments, you know whether it is man or woman, if the person is married or not, or how many children they have, what is their cultural group, the group they belong to, what language they speak. So even if you see them 20 meters away, you can see these ornaments as something that are very important in a tradition, and so we can project that the prehistoric human beings had the same attitude. So they're very important for archaeologists. And these ornaments are very different from the ones that we find, they're more numerous than the ones that we find in the levels occupied by modern human beings. In the Gravettian, there are only fossil shells that we know come from the Paris area, where there are various accumulations of fossil shells, but otherwise the objects found in the Aurignacian ivory, bare, but with a very bare bone with a very small perforation, and fragments of stalagmites, so that we haven't yet understood what they were used for, whether they were ornaments or not. This means that in the Château-Péronian levels of the last Neanderthals were really made by the Neanderthals, and they were very different from the ones found in the upper levels.
Ma come fate a capire da dove provengono le conchiglie?
How do you understand where the shells come from? Well, there are paleontologists, malacologists that are specialists of the species found in fossil finds. Prehistoric human beings found them on the beach, but sometimes they preferred the ones that came from fossil finds. That is to say, they've been there for millions of years in some cases, because they were much closer to their sites rather than the coast of the sea or of the ocean. So I think one way to know whether they were fossils or not is to study the ones that we find in these deposits. There are other ways to date or study them. For instance, we applied a isotopic analysis because the percentage of the isotopes changes over time. So this method, which is not only a method to date, but to analyze the percentage of the isotopes in the shells, will tell us whether they come from fossil or contemporary deposits. That is, contemporary meaning of the period. Were they fossils when they were taken or not? That's the question. These results, that is to say, the fact that the ornaments were of Neanderthal origin, also is confirmed by the distribution of pigments. There are less than half a kilo of pigments in the Ornithian or Proto-Ornithian levels, while there are many more in the Neanderthal ones. And as for the ornaments, they found more plentiful in the lower levels. So if it had come from the Ornithian, why had they crossed the 3 levels and all be in the lowest level? So in the recent years, we have seen articles, and we're moving on to the discovery that Dr. Bianucci was referring to, with reference to the fact that the Neanderthals also used abstract art in caves. One which I participated in is the study of this incision on a rock of a Gibraltar rock, which is called Goran's Cave. It was found at the end, and this incision has been discovered in Neanderthal areas. So we know that it's the Neanderthals that did it, but there is no way to date it. The oldest level is 39,000 years ago. So it was before 39,000 years ago. It was older than, but we don't know how old. And these incisions are not natural. I won't enter the details of this now. We were able to prove it. And we reproduced them experimentally. For example, we studied, it's quite a hard rock, and how many incisions it takes to reach the same depth and width. And so we created a model which tells us that you need between 188 and 317 strokes were necessary to produce it. So it's clearly voluntary one, a voluntary action, and they wished to leave a clear sign of their passage. Another example of possible Neanderthal art was after the dating in El Castillo. It's a very large Paleolithic art site in Santander in northern Spain, near it. And you can see calcite dating has shown that these discs and handprints were 40,800 years old, which is roughly when the last Neanderthals and the first early human beings met in that area. So maybe it is possible that these representations were not by human beings but by Neanderthals. Subsequently, with members of my team, I studied these discs, and we realized with chemical analysis and the way they were doing that these were not being done at the same time, but that they were done subsequently. We don't know whether they were Neanderthals or modern human beings. So the big discovery, the one which Dr. Bianucci was referring to, and the one which I please don't send tweets or WhatsApp because it's still embargoed for about 2 hours, is the article in Science, which I would like to be a co-author of, but I'm not, although the colleagues who worked on this article worked with me for 20 years. There are 3 caves in Spain, the Pasiega, Maltraviesa, and Argales, where 43 new dating on calcite with organgatorium, and the colleagues have reached to the conclusion that at the Pasiega, this red line, this part this abstract drawing and the handprint and a stalagmite covered in red pigment with other stalagmite on it. In these three cases, the painting are at least 65,000, 66,000 or 64,000 years old, and they're different ones, different datings for different sites. And since we know that at that time there were only Neanderthals, this means that the Neanderthals are the ones who made this, which previously had been attributed to modern beings. This is a very important discovery that we hope will be confirmed in the future, but which changes our vision of the Archaeopaleolithic art. These discoveries in Europe, the fact that the Neanderthals had practiced some of these innovations that we found in Africa, suggest that neither the sudden development 42,000 years ago, nor the gradual origin exclusively associated in Africa can explain the origin of symbolic behavior. What I've done here in an article, which I hope will be accepted, which I wrote with a philosopher, I have put or aggregated for various areas the emergence of cultural activities, and many of these before the arrival from Africa. So this pattern doesn't match a classically Darwinian vision whereby a new idea or cognition can develop through a mechanism of isolation of the species and of the emergence of advantageous mutations, which means that the new species replaces the old one. A simple biological mechanism aimed at explaining that since we became modern in Africa, we created all the innovations which are the hallmarks of other societies as we know it. Archaeology does not confirm this, does not explain this biological mechanism, but it suggests that the origin of the symbolic behavior of the material symbolism is the result of a more complex history where we must try to understand the cultural trajectory of each area of the planet. We can imagine them with a series of adaptations to climatic changes. Every climatic change of the same type, but which had different outcomes in various parts, has enabled a human society to rise to challenges. Some take advantage of it, while others continued to do what they were doing before, while others, in fact, disappeared. In some cases, they reacted to the challenge, creating more complex cultures, which developed symbolic and cultural complex systems. What I'm showing you here is not something exclusively theoretical. In fact, we now have the means to try and recreate these cultural trajectories, and in a series of articles, we use this method, which we called eco-cultural niche modeling, which is the use of predictive algorithms and environmental layers created by environmentalists to recreate the potential ecocultural niche of species or animal species, but we applied it instead to prehistory. How do these algorithms work? Well, in a few words, they use the presence, the geographical coordinates of the phenomenon which you're interested in, and many levels or layers of information, for example, temperature, lower temperature, higher temperature, average temperature. The index of presence, the geography of the area, to try and create a multivariate space where the species can live. Once you've created this, it can be projected to try and understand where it can live. We published and applied in our article that we try to apply it to the period and to the various sites. And when you working on the past, you have to use the climate models, the ones that are used to predict the future weather. We use them for the past. Now, for example, one of the latest articles is the ecocultural niche modeling of Still Bay. You probably know it because it's the period where in South Africa they produce these two-faced tips, the shells, the ones I showed you before, and the incisions, and try and understand how things change between 70,000 and the Huisson port, where you see these small segments. Which I showed you again before, the handles and the ostrich shells and some rather complex stone tools. We worked with climate modeling applied to predictive algorithms, and thus realized that there was a development of the niche between the Still Bay, the older period, and the more recent one. Although the material culture of the Still Bay was very complex and very difficult because very difficult to learn how to heat to stone and produce tips and touch them up. For example, in the Huisson sport, this tradition of the first ornaments disappears. So from a certain point of view, there is a cultural and technological system which is simpler in the later period, but in a period in which the climate becomes drier, it makes it possible for these populations to expand and occupy areas which they had not occupied in previous periods. Here I think we're now reaching the end of my presentation, and without wishing to debate the more theoretical ones, I would like to give you the three keys. The three ingredients of the recipe, which in my opinion at the present state would make it possible for human populations to develop material symbolic cultures and inventions without having the traditional oversimplified Darwinian system. The three elements are what we called cultural acceptation. Acceptation was created as a notion by Stephen Jay Gould to create an element which is determined by development but which is reused in the course of evolution for other aims or other means. For example, the use of ochre to protect yourself from ultraviolet rays. If you move to an area where the color of your skin it has to be exposed to more ultraviolet ones, go from this to the use of ochre for symbolic ones. This is a case of cultural acceptation. Another thing which is important is how modes of cultural transmission. There is no innovation that can be transmitted and accepted unless there is a system of teaching which makes it possible for new generations to understand it. And archaeologists have tried to extract this information on the complexity of the means of cultural transmission on the basis of the objects that we study. And this is what we tried to do in this article, where we modelized modes of cultural transmission and their complexity. So it is important to try and understand how innovations develop and the ability of the culture to invest in new means of cultural transmission. And the third ingredient has to do with the brain plasticity. We know that our brain is plastic. For example, if you learn how to read and write at 40, it has been proved that this, even at that age, leads to changes which are basic and even anatomical, which have to do with the connections in the brain. There is a potential, which is a potential that is not only of our species, but which I believe is of our genus, that is to say of archaic species too, of being able to use the potential of our brain brain to adapt or to make place to cultural changes or even to the loss of cultural changes. With these three elements, one can justify the emergence and sometimes the loss of fundamental cultural developments and innovation, some of them linked to the symbolic material culture, without having any biological changes which developed at the same time. And I would like to conclude this presentation with a slide that refers to many of the colleagues that have worked with me, not only colleagues but students. You already know Daniela Rosso, you can see her in the slide, but there are students, postdoc students, many of them students who subsequently became colleagues, and you see there are people who come from different nations. Sometimes they found a place in another country different from the one they were born in, like I did. I thought it was interesting for you to get acquainted with them. Thank you very much.
C'è sicuramente tempo per qualche domanda. Io ne ho subito una, che è un po' una...
We'd like to thank Francesco and Enrico. I'm sure there are time for a few questions. I have one I want to ask you immediately, which is halfway between a remark and a question. But how many scientific disciplines, how many types of scientists work to get these results? Because we've had archaeology, but also chemistry, physics, climate studies. They have to speak to each other, don't they? Have to communicate. It's fundamental, because increasingly, I was referring to this discovery in science, but there are archaeologists who know the caves and have, but without the work of the specialist in dating, for example, dating the calcite as the example, we wouldn't have understood, or the production of algorithms, predictive algorithms. It's something which comes from environmental studies, so you have to be acquainted with them. You have to work with the people who develop them, and also knowing what the limitations are, knowing what are also the faults or problems with the climate modeling. Sometimes, jokingly, I say there are some subjects which I know enough about to be dangerous. More than dangerous, you have to know what problems that other people have, be acquainted and aware, because this creates a basis for very fruitful cooperation. And as I was saying, it's very important in our societies to welcome innovation. We're in a world where you're going to have to learn for most of your life, because if not at 50, you may have to discover how new methods, how chemistry or mineralogical dating works. This is what happened to me, but brain plasticity helps us. I don't know. I'm not so sure about that. You need someone who has to coordinate all this. Yes, this is true. But the important thing is that the person who networks or coordinates should not impose their ideas, but listen to what the colleagues have to say. While we're listening to the first question, I think the first question being found, I would like to ask a question to see, which I'm asking to see if I've understood. If I understood correct, and in any case I found it very interesting, this fact that certain types of innovation happen in various places, and my question is the following. If we move from the notion of evolutionary tree, we now move to the idea of many bushes. This is also true for cultures. Cultures, too, are bushes that have developed in various parts. So we have to reduce also the importance of this major change of humans coming out of Africa. Yes, it is less. Certainly, for example, we know, genetics have shown that the last arrived from archaic populations in Africa is 34,000 years ago, which means the fact that there were modern human beings maybe 260,000 years ago, this is the most recent genetic studies, doesn't mean that modern humans were everywhere. There is a rival mixturing of archaic populations, which is true for Eurasia, also happened in Africa, and very often modern African people had very complex structures and civilizations, more or less complex. There is no correspondence, no defined correspondence currently between cultural complexity and biological development. And there is evidence that shows that levels of complexity, as we saw with Steve Bell, at one point may disappear. And one might even think that in 300,000 years or 20,000 years ago, people experimented and some experiments didn't work. And they launched in levels of complexity that didn't yield the results, so didn't hold to their promises when climate changed, say. And they became an engine of cultural change at that point. Yes, it's very interesting. Sometimes they worked and sometimes they didn't work.
Neanderthal, nel senso che come gli studi genetici.
It refers to the Neanderthals. In fact, just as genetic studies tell us that there's 3-4% of DNA in us that is Neanderthal. And clearly the meeting has been a meeting, but also a clash. The prevalence of modern human beings and Neanderthals, how is it explained? And in the sense that was there genocide, as one says, or was it the fact that the ones overwhelmed the others? Thank you. The way to answer this was to study the very few historical cases where there are hunter-gatherers who met with hunters, and it's not very different from what happened without going into cases where, for example, Western population have come across hunter-gatherers replacing them. We know, for example, in some cases they were sort of close to genocides or genocides. The fact is whether you reduce the population to a very small number, for example, Australian Aborigines, it has no implications on the cognitive ability of the people who were destroyed. While in the case of the Neanderthals, in the past at least, the argument of the destruction of the Neanderthals was an argument to explain that they were not as intelligent, and that's why they're not here. If we were to apply the same logic to all the populations that have been reduced to virtually zilch in the past 300 or 400 years through colonization, we would have to reach the same conclusion. While it is clear that we were a population that had an enormous cultural wealth. So this is the problem, and how, in fact, things went. Well, I think that there were probably a bit of everything. There were cases where they didn't seek contact, while other cases there were cultural exchanges, and cases where there were clashes, violent clashes. The arrival of modern humans in Europe took about 2,000, 3,000 years, long time. And they were very different situations. And they've also been studied that small advantages, for example, in the size of the group, or small innovations, cultural or technological innovations, long-standing, distant social bonds mean that in about 200 or 300 years, one population overtakes the other. Fine. Well, there is still one contribution. Yes. Reading what was suggested for the evening, I was especially interested in the definition creative deviance. and as if they were the value of a different person that can trigger an innovation, which must then have all the conditions for this to be confirmed and consolidated. Is this so? Well, creative deviance in the sense that in a text that I'd published, I tried to make a difference between intelligence and creativity. Very often they're seen as synonyms, but intelligence is something which refers to the personal idea, while creativity is very social. You can be very intelligent, but this may not contribute a lot to a society. It doesn't leave the space to be creative. So if the notion of creativity is something which is very recent in our history, in the history of Western thought, it develops with the Renaissance, didn't exist before, but in many traditional societies, this idea of creativity doesn't exist. We have to experience or live in a society that enables you to be creative, and this must mean that you allow deviance to exist. While societies that are very rigid and ways of learning that are very set, from the first months of their lives, so the children absorb the fact that they mustn't be creative, that they censor their creativeness, then they are not. When we see it in human history, we consider it positive, but it has not always been considered such, because it means risk-taking, and in traditional society, your head says, nope, we're not going to turn left because we've been turning right for the past 100 years, and that's the way we do it. So you must be careful. You must beware. Because in human history, creativity has always been a challenge. You must find a balance and creativity. It's a challenge. You must know when you can have innovation and when you can't. It reminds me of evolution. Deviance, difference. Yes and no, because in evolution, selective pressure depends also on our ability to procreate. Sometimes it's a game that's more individual than collective. Creativity is the effort of one person to transform their intelligence into a social fact, sometimes even against their interest. Thank you very much. I would like to thank Francesco De Rico. Thank you. See you.